Nobody in the atrium of Harberton Health Group gave a second glance to the man standing near the service entrance with a folder pressed flat against the side of his coat. Calvin Fenton had arrived 11 minutes early for a custodial interview, which he had learned over the past 2 years was the kind of quiet discipline that impressed nobody in a hiring process but kept a person from feeling entirely worthless inside one. The woman at the reception desk, Blythe Connors according to her lanyard, looked up from her screen long enough to take in his jacket. The one he'd repaired twice at the left elbow, and the small gap between his collar and the tie he'd knotted carefully that morning. She smiled in the way people sometimes smile when they are deciding in advance that someone is about to waste their time. Custodial, Blythe said not as a question. Night rotation? Calvin confirmed both. She printed a visitor tag without looking at him again, and told him to wait by the chairs along the east wall, the ones that faced away from the main lobby's floor-to-ceiling windows. He sat, placed his folder on his knee, and noted that the ventilation panel above the fire exit was rattling at irregular intervals. Old motor, probably, identifiable the way some people identify a wrong note in music, without thinking and without effort. He did not mention it to anyone. Blythe typed his name into the system and turned back to her phone call. His full name, Calvin Edward Fenton, appeared in the pending applications queue a few seconds later. What neither Blythe nor anyone else on the ground floor could have anticipated was the small red indicator that attached itself automatically to that entry when it reached the digital review panel on the 16th floor. The label beside the flag read only, "Founder Review Required. Escalate immediately." The assistant who saw it stopped typing. Ingrid Calloway was midway through a slide presentation about the pending Meridian acquisition, a deal that would expand Harberton into 3 additional provinces and generate roughly $400 million in projected revenue over the first decade. Lawrence Dodd, the chief operating officer and the most senior voice on the executive floor, had spent 6 weeks building pressure behind the deal and was now asking her, not for the first time that week, to approve the final framework before the competing offer closed. She trusted Dodd's experience. She did not as yet trust the deal itself. Her assistant entered the room without knocking, which they had standing permission to do in 2 situations: a patient safety emergency or a founder-level flag. The assistant placed a single printed alert in front of Ingrid, said nothing, and left. Ingrid read the name on the sheet once. Then she set her pen down. She had been 18 when her father, Harber Calloway, founded the health group in a converted clinic in Waterloo. She had watched him run it for 20 years before his heart failed, and she had spent the 11 months since his death learning that the organization he left behind contained rooms she had not yet been given keys to. Among the items in his private office, kept sealed for months while his estate was settled, had been a small folder bound with a rubber band. Inside, a handwritten letter addressed to her, a worn photo badge issued to a clinical systems engineer, and 3 words in her father's handwriting at the top of the first page: "Do not bury this." The badge had carried a name, Calvin Edward Fenton. She had tried to locate records connected to that name within the company's archives. What she found instead was a systematic absence: files noted as archived but unavailable, personnel records with redacted fields, technical incident logs that stopped mid-thread, and resumed several entries later as though a section had simply been lifted out. Which position? Ingrid asked her assistant through the intercom. Night custodial, 16th floor facilities team. Across the table, Lawrence Dodd had noticed the interruption. He had a way of watching people's faces with the steady patience of someone who had done it long enough to catch the small things. He asked if there was a problem. Ingrid said it was a staffing matter. She turned the printout face down. She waited until Dodd and the others had stepped into the side offices before she called the reception desk directly. She told Blythe Connors in a tone that closed the matter before it opened that Calvin Fenton was not to be dismissed, not to be turned away, and not to be left in the general waiting area where half the building's corridor traffic could observe him. "Bring him up," she said directly, not through HR. She was still at the window when her assistant came back to say that Lawrence Dodd had returned to the hallway and was asking a question, not about the acquisition this time, but about something else entirely. Whether a man named Calvin Fenton had come in for an interview that morning. Down in the atrium, things had changed quickly. Blythe had received the call from the 16th floor, but had relayed it in a way that reversed its meaning. She announced to the waiting area that Calvin's file had been flagged from the executive level, and that he should surrender his visitor tag and wait by security for further processing. The implication, delivered loudly enough for the other applicants to absorb, was that a problem had been found. Calvin stood, straightened his jacket, and asked, at a volume that carried no edge whatsoever, whether this was Harberton's formal response to his application. 2 security staff arrived. Then Ingrid's assistant arrived and asked the security staff to step aside. The elevator ride to the 16th floor took less than 40 seconds. The assistant made a small attempt at conversation and asked whether Calvin had been to the executive floors before. He said he had. The layout had changed, but the server access corridor was in the same position it had always been, which was something he'd noticed from the elevator panel before the doors had opened. The assistant did not respond to that. Calvin watched the polished steel of the elevator doors and recognized, in the floor plan visible through the glass partition, a rearrangement that had removed 2 structural observation points from the building's monitoring grid. It was not a renovation decision anyone with a facilities background would make voluntarily. It looked, to someone who understood what the original grid had been designed to catch, like something removed on purpose. He cataloged it the way he cataloged everything, quietly, specifically, without yet knowing what to do with what he was seeing. Lawrence Dodd was already in the boardroom when Calvin stepped onto the executive floor. He introduced himself without offering a handshake and described Calvin as a former contractor who had left the organization under circumstances that remained, in his word, disputed, and suggested to Ingrid that the legal team be given the file before any conversation took place. Calvin looked at the man and said nothing. Ingrid placed her father's letter on the table and asked the only question she had come to this meeting wanting answered. Why had Harberton Health Group treated a former systems engineer as a liability for 7 years while continuing to operate the infrastructure he had designed? Calvin recognized Harbor Calloway's handwriting on the envelope. He did not ask her to open it. He told her that whatever her father had written, the debt he was owed wasn't something he had come to collect. He had come for a night shift and health coverage. His daughter was 10 years old and had asthma. He needed the benefits package. Ingrid asked why a clinical systems engineer was applying to empty waste bins. Calvin said that a man whose professional file carried the notation involved in a patient data breach found that most hospitals did not call him back after the second interview. He said it, without bitterness and, without drama, the way a person states a fact they have had time to accept. Dodd interrupted to remind the room of the incident, a data system failure 7 years earlier that had compromised 3 months of patient monitoring records and triggered a regulatory review. Calvin had violated access protocol, he said. The incident report had been unambiguous. Calvin asked whether the original incident report was still in the file. Dodd said the retention window had closed and the document had been archived under standard policy. Calvin said, "Then you are citing a document that no longer exists as your reason for keeping a man from mopping floors." Ingrid noticed how quickly Dodd's answer had come and how little it resembled one. She offered Calvin a consultancy payment, a quiet resolution. He declined. He said he had accepted a quiet resolution once already, and the silence it had purchased had not protected his family. It had only protected the people who needed him to stay silent. Ingrid put him on a 30-day facilities trial, assigned to the night rotation under Rosa Kamau, the facilities supervisor who had managed the custodial staff for nearly 15 years, and who had a way of knowing, within the first week of a new hire, exactly what kind of person they were. Dodd objected. Ingrid noted that custodial staff worked supervised in all restricted areas and that every corridor was on camera. She told Dodd the matter was settled. Before Calvin left the room, he mentioned, without being asked, that the biomedical monitoring feed displayed on the wall panel in the East Wing was showing a latency pattern consistent with a switching relay that was beginning to fail. He said it the way he might mention that a door was ajar. Dodd told him he hadn't touched a real system in 7 years and suggested he concern himself with learning where the supply closets were. Calvin said a system does not care what the person who notices its fault is wearing. Each night before his shift started, Calvin called home. His daughter, Mara, had taken to asking him questions about the hospital with the same careful patience she applied to most things, precise, unhurried, waiting for the full answer. He told her he was helping people see things they had missed. She considered that for a moment and said it sounded important. He agreed that it was, reminded her where the spare inhaler was, and that her grandmother would be there before school. He hung up and walked back in. Rosa Kamau had managed enough people over the years to know within the first week which new hires were passing through and which ones took the work seriously. Calvin Fenton was the latter from his first shift. He never left a task half-finished. He checked equipment no one had asked him to check. He worked through the difficult assignments, without complaint and without acknowledgement that they were difficult. Some of the day staff had heard about the incident on the executive floor and referred to him in the corridors as the engineer with the mop bucket. Never quite loud enough to address directly, always loud enough to be heard. Calvin noted which corridors they used and gave them no reaction whatsoever. What he found on the third week, in the biomedical storage wing, was more serious than a rattling ventilation motor. A batch of maintenance records showed service contracts awarded to a vendor whose equipment had failed certification testing 18 months earlier. The same vendor whose parts were now installed in the monitoring relay stations across 4 patient wards. And the relay stations, when he checked them against the original design specifications he had written himself and still remembered without needing to reference, were not functioning to spec. He reported it to the facility's maintenance lead. He was told he was still in his probationary period, and that unverified concerns from custodial staff were not the standard pathway for raising equipment flags. Rosa quietly kept a copy of his written notes. Ingrid reviewed the security footage that week and watched Calvin move through the building the way a person moves through a space they once built, checking not what was visible, but what was underneath it. She opened her father's letter that same night. Harper Calloway had not been a man who apologized easily. He had written the letter over 3 sittings, noted by a date at the top of each page. He wrote that the data breach 7 years earlier had not been caused by Calvin Fenton at all. Calvin had discovered the vulnerability, had raised it through every proper channel without response, and had finally patched a critical gap in the patient record system using a manual workaround he designed himself during a single, overnight shift. The records had been protected. The regulatory breach that followed had been a separate incident, a server migration error, introduced 2 weeks later by a third-party contractor. Harber wrote that Lawrence Dodd had advised him strongly to make Calvin the public explanation for the breach. The contractor relationship was too expensive to damage. The regulatory fine could be absorbed. A junior systems engineer could be managed. Harber wrote that he had agreed. He wrote that he had not been proud of it since. Near the bottom of the second page, in smaller handwriting than the rest. Lawrence is still using the same contractor. Find out why. Ingrid sat with the letter for a long time before she picked up the phone. She had retained an independent auditor, Eli Stanton, a forensic financial reviewer based in Ottawa. 2 weeks earlier, after Dodd had pushed for the Meridian acquisition with an urgency that had no clean explanation, Stanton's preliminary findings arrived the morning after Ingrid read the letter. The findings were not preliminary anymore. The vendor supplying substandard components to Harberton's monitoring systems was registered to a numbered company in New Brunswick. That numbered company shared a director with a private equity fund. The fund held a significant position in a competing health network, one that stood to benefit substantially from Harberton's valuation declining before the Meridian acquisition closed. Dodd's name did not appear on any document directly. His wife's did. Blythe Connors had, in the meantime, been instructed by someone senior to locate a reason to end Calvin's probationary period early. She told Rosa that she had flagged a restricted area access concern and that Calvin should surrender his facilities badge pending review. Rosa arrived with the shift assignment log before Blythe finished her sentence. The hearing was held in the main boardroom 4 days later. Dodd presented the 7-year-old incident as evidence of character. He described Calvin as a disruptive presence with a history of overstepping his role. He asked the board whether they preferred the account of a woman who had guided the organization through 3 CEO transitions or a man who had arrived for work in a coat with a repaired elbow. 2 board members laughed at the comparison. Calvin asked to see the original incident documentation. The metadata on the digital version showed it had been created 14 months after the date printed at the top of the page. Dodd said Calvin was speculating without proof. Ingrid presented her father's letter. Dodd called it a private communication with no procedural standing. Eli Stanton stepped forward and walked the board through 11 invoices, each one paid to a vendor whose parts had failed independent certification. Each transaction modest enough on its own to pass a routine review, consistent enough across 3 years to form a pattern that was not accidental. He displayed them in sequence. Several directors who had approved those budgets without close scrutiny shifted visibly in their chairs. The money led to a fund. The fund led to a directorship. The directorship led to a name. Dodd pivoted. He accused Ingrid and Calvin of coordinating a narrative to block the acquisition for personal reasons. Calvin asked to display the original monitoring schematics on the room's main screen and walked through them, not quickly, not with any performance attached to it, explaining in plain terms what the system had been designed to do and where it had been quietly modified to underperform. He showed the board the gap between what the maintenance invoices recorded and what the installed equipment's serial numbers confirmed. A board member near the center of the table asked Calvin how he could speak with such precision about technical specifications from 7 years ago without documentation of his own to reference. Calvin said he remembered because he had built it. He said some things stay with a person, not because they are trying to hold on to them, but because the circumstances in which they were built made them impossible to forget. He had worked through a night shift with patient data on the line and a team of people whose jobs depended on what happened in the next few hours, and he had fixed it with what he had available. That kind of night, he said, does not leave you. The room was quiet in a way it had not been before. Dodd made one final attempt, a motion to remove Ingrid from the chair on procedural grounds, citing a conflict of interest. 4 board members he had cultivated over the years seconded the motion immediately. The vote was called. At that moment, the monitoring displays along the eastern wall of the boardroom went dark. Calvin looked at the panel, looked at Rosa standing near the door, and said they had approximately 8 minutes before the backup switching relay on the 3rd floor completed its failure cycle. If it went down completely, It would sever the live connection to Eli Stanton's independently mirrored audit files, the only copies that existed outside Harberton's internal server. The timing was not a coincidence. Dodd said he was manufacturing a crisis to delay the vote. Ingrid halted the meeting and authorized full technical access on the spot. Calvin did not act alone. He assigned Rosa to coordinate communications with the facilities team. He sent a junior biomedical technician to isolate the failing relay while he worked on the backup line, a secondary routing pathway he had designed into the original system precisely because he had known, even then, that a single point of failure was not good engineering. The pathway had never been removed because no one who came after him had understood it well enough to know it was there. Dodd attempted to leave the boardroom with a tablet and a folder of contracts. Ingrid asked security to maintain the room's occupancy until the audit data was confirmed secure. With barely 90 seconds remaining, one of the younger technicians hesitated at a junction box, uncertain which cable to isolate for first. Calvin crossed the room without raising his voice, guided the young man's hands, and explained each step as he went. Not because there was time to spare for teaching, but because he refused to let panic replace precision, even now. 6 minutes and 40 seconds after the warning appeared, the secondary line activated. Every display in the boardroom came back. The audit files were intact. The command logs showed that the relay failure had been triggered remotely, authorized by Dodd's own executive account, timed 2 days earlier to coincide precisely with the board vote. Nobody in the room laughed when Calvin walked back in. Dodd said he had simply gotten lucky with an old patch in an old system. Ingrid placed Calvin's original employee badge, recovered from her father's folder, beside the printed copy of Eli Stanton's findings and addressed the room directly. "He just protected this organization for the second time," she said. "He did it in the same clothes he wore to clean these floors. And we spent 7 years letting people believe he was the reason we nearly failed the first time." The board asked Calvin whether he intended to use his rights under the original clinical systems agreement, the document Dodd had filed away rather than registered formally, to block the acquisition entirely. Calvin thought about the 340 people who worked in non-executive positions at Harberton. He thought about Mara's spare inhaler on the kitchen's counter. He thought about the version of himself that had walked into this building 2 months ago, with a repaired elbow and a plastic-sleeved folder, and no particular expectation of anything except a steady paycheck and health coverage. He said he would not block anything. He required 3 things before any acquisition proceeded: an independent patient safety audit of all current monitoring equipment, restoration of accurate employment records for every staff member affected by contractor-related decisions in the past decade, and a formal protection mechanism for facilities and custodial workers who raised technical safety concerns through proper channels. Dodd was escorted from the boardroom. As he passed Calvin, he said that a man who had walked in here to empty waste bins had no business believing himself relevant. Calvin said that was true, and said that was exactly what had let him see what the people on the 16th floor had decided a long time ago wasn't worth looking at. Blythe Connors was placed on administrative review. Calvin did not speak on her behalf. He also did not ask for anything beyond what the process required, and he noted to himself that the two were different things. Ingrid offered Calvin the position of Director of Clinical Systems and Infrastructure, a role she wrote from scratch based on what he had demonstrated rather than what any prior title had claimed. He asked that Rosa Kamau be given a seat on the new Patient Safety Committee because Rosa understood the people who moved through the building after midnight in a way that no one who had only ever seen it during business hours ever quite would. He accepted the position. He finished the shift he had already started before the board meeting ended. Ingrid found him in the East Wing corridor at 11:15, cleaning the baseboards near the section of wall where the failed relay had once been mounted. She asked why he was still doing it. Calvin straightened and said that a person doesn't stop caring about a thing simply because powerful people have decided it's beneath them to notice it. Ingrid took the empty supply cart and walked it back to the storage room herself. It was a small gesture, but Calvin saw it and understood that she meant it, and that was enough. Mara Fenton heard the full story on a Saturday afternoon, months later, when she was old enough to follow its shape without the edges frightening her. Her father did not tell it as a story of triumph. He told it as a story about patience, about what it means to keep doing careful work in rooms where nobody is watching, and about the difference between being overlooked and being invisible. He told her the two were not the same thing, even when they feel exactly like it. She thought about that for a while, the way she thought about most things. Then she asked if the hospital was better now. Calvin said it was getting there. She said that was good. Then she asked if he wanted help with the dishes. He did.